Hey everyone, welcome to the cabin. My name's Alec Brits, and today we're going to be talking about compression. I'm going to go over all of the basics, and then most importantly show you how to use it in a musical fashion. I've broken down the video into chapters right around here, so if you want to jump around, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much for watching, let's get right into it. So what is compression? Compression is often described as making loud things quiet and quiet things loud. So if something is very loud, the compressor will try to reduce the amount of gain to make it at a more similar volume to something that is at a slightly lower volume. This is a very handy tool which might be able to help you with things like automation, where you don't have to keep raising and lowering the fader all the time. Compression is quite difficult to hear, especially if it's subtle. More aggressive compression is a lot easier to hear because you hear more of the compressor itself and oftentimes the ambience in which the instrumental voice was recorded. For all of our examples today, I'm going to be using the FabFilter Pro C2 compressor. The reason I'm going to use this is because it shows you the different ways of illustrating gain reduction very easily. If we look at the red line over here, as it dips down, that is the amount of volume that it is taking away from the source. Then if we look on the side, we have a red bar that is showing the gain reduction as well, in a more traditional style where it is just using a bar graph to show you how much volume it's taking out. Let's talk about threshold. Threshold is potentially one of the most important things that is on a compressor. It's the control that shows the compressor when to start compressing. If you have your threshold set in such a way that only the louder peaks are going to be gripped, then you're going to have a much more even performance that comes out of the compressor. If your threshold is set at a point that is too sensitive, then absolutely everything will be compressed and you will start to lose some of the natural dynamic. Of course, this might be exactly what you're going for, but in the example I'm about to show you with the vocal, we're going to try and get a more even performance without affecting the vocal tone too much with compression.
Sweating on the backseat, I don't wanna go in. You're pulling me off my cars. Sweating on the backseat, I don't wanna go in. You're pulling me off my cars.
When you look at them together, the one on the top is the uncompressed one, and the one on the bottom is the one that has now been bounced in place with compression. We can now see that the overall performance is a lot more even. Though it's not making the quietest parts any louder, it's pulling in those higher peaks so that it's a much more even performance. The next thing to talk about on a compressor is the knee. The knee of a compressor shows us how a compressor is going to transition from uncompressed into compressed. We generally have two different ways of using the knee. The first is the soft knee, which is a more linear and kind of even way of compressing. It's more smooth sounding and provides a more natural form of compression. The other option is the hard knee. The hard knee is very precise and non-linear and is a lot easier to hear when it's in full operation. I'm going to show you an example now where the threshold is set at the same point, but the knee shape is different, and hopefully we'll be able to hear the difference between a hard knee and a soft knee.
Sweating on the backseat, I don't wanna go in. You're pulling me off my cars. With the heart like concrete and the one-way time sheet, was I now worth more?
As you can see over here, as I'm changing the knee of the compressor, the threshold seems to be changing as well. Although the threshold is not physically changing, the characteristic of how it's transitioning from uncompressed to compressed is changing quite dramatically. With compression, it's always really important to remember the fact that everything interacts completely throughout the unit. So make sure that you really pay attention to when you're changing one artifact, whether it be the knee or the threshold or the attack. That is going to affect how much compression is taking place. It's not as simple as setting the threshold and then setting the ratio and then setting the knee. All of these things interact with each other. Let's talk about ratio. Ratio tells the compressor by how much it is going to reduce the gain after you have gone over the threshold we discussed earlier. Let's say you go over the threshold by 4 decibels and you have a ratio of 2 to 1. The compressor will divide those 4 decibels by 2 and leave you with 2 dBs above the threshold still. This allows you to be able to select different kinds of ratios depending on how aggressive you want the compressor to work. By changing the ratio, you can also notice the shape of the knee changes. This means that the higher the ratio, the more likely you are to hear compression. 2:1 up until about 6:1 is nice and medium style compression. 8:1 up until 16:1 is a little bit more aggressive style compression. 20:1 to 100:1 is defined as limiting. I'm going to show you a couple of examples now by simply changing the ratio without changing the threshold, and you can start to see how the compressor will react differently in the FabFilter Pro C2.
With the heart like concrete and the one-way timesheet, was I now worth more? With the heart like concrete and the one-way timesheet, was I now worth more?
The next thing to talk about is attack. This is how fast the compressor is going to react after you've gone over the threshold. So if you're recording something like a drum kit where there are very fast peaks happening all the time, you need to really check that you're not taking away from those peaks, but you're also not missing what you're trying to compress. I'm going to show you a couple of examples on a snare drum where we can have a slightly slower attack where the initial transient goes through and then the compression occurs. And then I'm going to show you an example where we have a really fast compressor gripping the front of the snare drum so that the overall tone of the drum is evened out. When it comes to vocals, picking the appropriate attack time is really important. If the attack time is too quick, sometimes the vocal can sound a bit unnatural and a bit squeezed in strange places. However, if it's too slow, then sometimes you get a strange compression effect.
With the heart like concrete and the one-way timesheet, was I now worth more? With the heart like concrete and the one-way timesheet, was I now worth more? With the heart like concrete and the one-way timesheet, was I now worth more?
Now let's talk about release. Release is the rate at which a compressor goes back to uncompressed after you have exceeded the threshold. What I love about release is the fact that it can be extremely musical. If you have a very fast release, sometimes that can sound quite unnatural. And if your release is too slow, then the compressor will not have been able to come back to its zero unity position before the next heavy peak has been absorbed. What I love to do is to have the release of my compressor set to a BPM of the song. Now, many compressors only work in milliseconds. There's very few that have a BPM sync function on them. So a small little trick here is to take 60,000 divided by the BPM of the song, and voila, you have your quarter note value. If you want to get the eighth note value, all you have to do is divide that resultant of 60,000 divided by BPM, and then divide that by 2, and that's 8 notes. Take it again to 4 for your 16th and 8 for your 32nd notes, or save yourself a whole lot of time and go onto a website I spoke about in my 5 ways to improve your production video called TuneForm. I'm not sponsored by them, but I use this on a daily basis, not only for compression, but also for reverbs and delays. The best thing about doing this is the fact that you can tailor your releases to be in time. So if you have a room mic that you are compressing on a drum kit, the whole drum kit pumps in time with the music. And if you do that across a whole bunch of different tracks at varying levels, then all of a sudden the whole groove of the track starts to really lock together. I'm going to show you some examples now of how to tailor your release times in such a way to improve the groove of a track. Let's talk about parallel compression. Basically, parallel compression allows you to be able to take the dry, uncompressed signal and then have a very compressed signal and put them together. There's a couple of ways of doing this. In the analog domain, if you have a line splitter, then you can come out of your mic pre, split the signal, one to go straight into your DAW and the other to go straight into a compressor. Then you can tailor your compressor to do exactly what you want or be aggressive with it and record both signals and then blend them together so that you can basically have a dry, which is the uncompressed signal, and the wet, which is the compressed signal, and get a blend between the two. In the digital world, there's two ways of doing this. You can take your uncompressed signal, duplicate it, and then take a compressor of your choice, do some heavy compression, and then blend that back in with your uncompressed signal. The other way, which I would be cautious of, is to take an auxiliary bus within your DAW and then put a compressor on that auxiliary bus and then again blend to taste. The only reason I would be a little bit apprehensive of doing it this way is the fact that sometimes there is a bit of latency between the auxiliary buses and the actual signal itself, so sometimes things can sound a bit phasey. So in this example over here, I'm going to take a drum kit and smash the heck out of a compressor, and then I'm going to blend that right back in with the original signal. This is going to raise the overall energy of the drum kit without increasing the volume too much. Because of the nature of the extreme compression, that's going to make the whole ambience of the room really climb out of the speakers in a nice musical way. For the drum example, I'm going to use my favorite drum parallel compressor, and that is the Chandler Xena compressor by UAD. It's very important that when you're using this on vocals or on anything where there is a gap between any kind of audio, in the case of vocals, there's obviously a lot of breaths and that kind of thing, so it's important to cut those out or else they will be heavily exaggerated by huge amounts of compression. Let's talk about master bus compression. When should you put a master bus compressor on your production? For me personally, I like to be able to have my mix at a point where I can listen to it from top to bottom without anything jumping out at me. I'm not talking about fine detail automation here, just a nice clean mix with maybe a little bit of clip gaining to make sure that everything's working the way I want it to. This is the point where I would put the bus compressor in, and at the loudest point of the song, I would want it to be doing about 3 dBs of gain reduction at the most. If a bus compressor works too hard, that kind of sucks the dynamics out, and you'll find that the quieter parts of a song will become quite loud and the louder parts will feel really congested and really locked down. The sound of a bus compressor is really important. To me, it's almost like the final gloss at the end of a painting, where it ties together all of the individual elements that I've worked really hard to create and to put into this production. Then when you start mixing and you start adding all of your different colors into the mix, you'll find that you are reacting to the bus compressor and it just sits in a nice and musical way, and you will be pushing against it without having to worry too much about peaking or being worried about adding a bus compressor in later so that it doesn't quite sit as well as it would have done if you added it in early in the process. So how do you know when you've compressed too much? This is a question that I ask myself a lot of the time. While compression is a very addictive effect, it can take the natural dynamic and the natural feel out of things really quickly. If you have compressed every single stem within your project in an aggressive manner, you're not going to have any massive dynamic changes. The other thing to realize with compression is that if you've been mixing for a long time during a day, and you start to compress more aggressively in the evening, it's usually because you have quite a lot of ear fatigue, and you got to be careful with that. Monitoring at a lower level often will show you when you are compressing too much, because things start to sound a little bit kind of out of place and a bit congested. Usually with compression, a little bit goes a long way, and because you're doing little bits on all of your tracks or on some of your tracks, that combined effort combined with the bus compressor can yield a very nice natural use of compression. When it comes to compression, it makes a lot of sense to put a lot of time into practicing it. Using it subtly across a bunch of different things rarely ties a mix together, but if you use it too aggressively, it can really rob a mix and a good performance of good dynamics. Thank you guys so very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this tutorial on compression, then give it the old thumbs up. If you have subscribed to the channel, thank you so very much for subscribing. If you would like to subscribe to the channel, then please feel free to do so. Most importantly, I hope that you're all looking after yourselves and you're being kind. I'll see you in the next one.